Like this? No need to get strapped? No? Okay. Glad to see that everyone had a safe drive in. I knew that snowfall would probably prevent a lot of people from getting on the road. I'm going to keep this not necessarily brief. I can't promise that anytime I'm up here, but I know that I don't want to compete against the weather, but I want to make sure that we have the time to appropriately spend in the Word tonight as we dive into something that I think we're all very familiar with to a certain extent, and that's the parable of the Good Samaritan. So we will be spending the majority of our time in Luke chapter 10. There's multiple lessons that I think are wrapped into this parable, which doesn't necessarily make it uniquely apart from other parables, but one thing that it does set aside, at least for me, is that I always forget that this parable is a parable. It's really talked about, and the example that's provided by Christ, it really sounds like this is something that he witnessed, although we have no evidence to support that. But it does sound like a scenario in which he would have witnessed given this time frame. The three main lessons that I think can be taken away from this is that we are to love everyone and do unto everyone as Christ commands. That tends to be the main lesson that comes out of the conversation, if you will, between the expert of the law and Christ here. The second one that I've heard most often is love everyone without measure or yield. There is not a stopping point to which our love ends. And then the third one that I did not hear until it was shared with me in the same way that it's being shared with you tonight, always be prepared to defend Christ as Christ defended himself. Seems a bit paradoxical in a way, Christ defending himself. But as was pointed out this morning by Bill, the last week of Christ was very compact. There was a lot he wished to accomplish because he knew that eventually he would be under fire, he would be arrested. And it seems that from the beginning, there was always plots, schemes, opportunities scarcely missed to try to trip him up, get him to admit something, get him to break a law, looking for any excuse. And I think this is another example of how we are to be prepared when we might have to defend our faith. It's a different perspective, one that I hadn't often heard before. Let's go ahead and start reading in Luke chapter 10, verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus replied, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" The expert answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" The possible motives for the expert of the law vary. They vary based off of translation and also commentary. There's one perspective that this expert in the law was actually there to learn from Christ, that he was interested in understanding the style of Christ's teaching. Another perspective is to understand Christ's motives, why he was teaching, what was the point, what was the purpose. There's another perspective that's been shared with me before, and that is that this expert in the law might have been there to trap, may have been there to test. You see, in the interaction here, Christ did not have to respond by allowing the expert to dive into the old law. If there were other individuals present, why not just cite from himself? He is the Word. His apostles had a limited understanding of that, and we knew that the Jews at this time did not. Neither did the courts. Many did not believe Christ to be who he said he was. But if he was not in an adversarial company, why reference the old law at all? It was a way, I think, in a lot of ways, to ensure that he would not be accused of refuting or denying the old law. He used a measure of understanding that he had in common with the expert of the law, this lawyer. Something he knew that he would readily understand, but the overall message and the point and the question would not be lost. If he was trying to learn from Christ, he would have accepted just about any answer from Christ. But he didn't. Right? Then again, Christ didn't exactly give him an answer. He allowed him to answer for himself, knowing full well what he would reference, which we have Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. It's the reference the lawyer made to the first half of his answer of love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength, with all your mind. And then the last part was added. That part comes from Leviticus 19:18. Love thy neighbor as yourself. The combination of these two elements, given the fact that one is referenced in Deuteronomy and the other one is referenced in Leviticus, gives us kind of a historical context of how the old law was being taught at this time. There was already a unified we don't know necessarily that it was called the Torah at that time, but the old law had been compiled into something that was easily referenceable for experts in the law to utilize. It was systematic, it was unified, and there was, as far as we know, only one way in which the information was controlled, and that was through the Jewish community and the hierarchy there within. Christ, in his wisdom in this instance, is an excellent example of how we can keep poise and keep structure when faced with possible adversity. Christ could have taken a confrontational approach. Had every right to. But he immediately started with common ground. He knew the expert was an expert in the law. He immediately started by referencing something that they had in common. He knew in order to get the point across, that was going to be essential. Let's read on as he shares the parable. In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.'" Before we get into the last exchange between Christ and the lawyer, there's another significant lesson to be had in this parable that's clearly shown here. The extra mile. When the Samaritan came across this wounded traveler, he was half dead, near death. took pity on him, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine to heal and repair, put him up in an inn to rest. And the next day, the Samaritan left. So the Samaritan stayed with him overnight and kept watch, probably continually tending to his needs and his wounds. Gave the innkeeper 2 silver coins. It's about a 2 days' wage in that time, and would have allowed the man to stay there for probably up to about 2 weeks. And then took the extra mile. Furthermore, what he already has done, when I return, I will reimburse you, whatever the expense, whatever this man needed. All right? Sometimes going the extra mile for us means understanding the context of what we're looking at. Understanding not just that we're interacting with someone who actually has need, but understanding why they have need. That takes compassion, that takes understanding, commitment, time. It requires more than 2 silver coins. The silver coins in a lot of ways is almost the least of what this man chose to provide. Provided safety and care, compassion. Took care of him, healed his wounds. The 2 coins, as well as his offer to reimburse the innkeeper, is him communicating that he understood the context. This man had been robbed. He had nothing. Everything was taken from him. I could take care of him, heal his wounds, leave him at the inn. I've done my job. I did a good thing. But now where will that man go from here? He has nothing. The Samaritan took the time to understand the context and what the next step that would be necessary to supply this man with care. It's also worth noting here the significance of Christ using a priest and a Levite as an example. I feel like this also provides a little bit more evidence for not necessarily a confrontation, but perhaps an adversarial conversation. Christ knew that in a public place like this, he had to be clever, quick-minded, wise. Couldn't cite gospel truth, couldn't cite himself. Had to utilize the old law. Again, a mutual understanding between he and the expert of the law. But he still got the point across because the priest and the Levite, experts in the law, would have been the ones to pass on the other side of the road. Due to cultural, societal, and perhaps racial reasons at that time. Samaritans were not well liked and particularly not well treated. It would have been nothing. It would have been common to see a priest or a Levite pass a man on the side of the road and not help. Had to remain clean. But a Samaritan, someone not well respected, not well reliked, he chose to stop. I think Christ used this example because he wanted to, again, provide another instance of how the rules that would govern everyone's lives from that point forward were not from the past. They were what was happening right then. The priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan would not be held to any cultural, racial, or societal standards. They would be held to Christ's standard. The expectation was clear for all 3 in the parable, but only one achieved that outcome. We have no reference for the man who fell to the hands of the robbers, what his nationality, what his affiliation was. Some commentaries I read said it impertinent. Some said that it was possible Samaritan, which is why the Samaritan would have stopped to help in the first place. But I think that diminishes the significance of what Christ is trying to point out here, if we assume that the individual on the side of the road was Samaritan. He's trying to point out that regardless of the affiliation to the old law, regardless of to what claims we've had in the past, this was the focus. Going the extra mile, loving thy neighbor as thyself, was the focus. The ending here, which of these three, starting in verse 36, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law had no other answer. There was no other option here. He said the one who had mercy on him. Notice how he didn't say the Samaritan. Right? Even then, that culture held the expert. He said the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus' reply was, go and do likewise. Go and do likewise. It's a high charge, really. It's a high charge to take an introspective look at ourselves and ask whether or not we are capable of going and doing likewise. If you take all these lessons into consideration, loving everyone, do unto everyone as Christ commands. Everyone. That's a tall charge. Can you think of someone that you might pass by on the other side if they were on the road? What type of contextual understanding, what kind of compassion, what kind of motive would it take for you to stop and be the Samaritan? It's a challenge. It's a challenge. But it can always be an opportunity as well. I like to think that because of the third point that I've been provided with this lesson, always be prepared to defend our faith and to defend our faith in Christ. I think the expert might have walked away from this engagement with a little bit different perspective. There was almost a sense of not retreat, but compliance at the end. He knew the point, right? And he even knew when he was not necessarily wrong, but he knew when he needed to bolster himself up. Back in verse 29, but he wanted to justify himself. He knew the reputation of the man that he was talking to. Had to feel like he had to puff himself up. Is that how we feel when we're trying to prove or defend our faith? Or do we start with mutual understanding? Find a compassionate connection with people? Or do we take the attitude that we're simply right and they're simply wrong? Loving everyone without measure or yield. That's another tough one. When I was living in Chicago, there, and I'm sure I would have heard if the problem had been resolved, but there's a very intense homelessness issue. A lot of people do not have a place to sleep at night. And that includes nights like tonight, when there's -2-degree winds and no corner in that city that you can hide from wind. It's kind of dark and horrifying to think about, but every spring, not every spring, but when the snow piles do thaw, sometimes there are bodies in them. The people that needed help. It was a painful thing that I learned while I was there. I had no idea that type of thing existed. And it was troublesome at times as well, because I knew there were people that needed help and I didn't know how to help them. I didn't know what to do. My idea or fears of safety got in my way of making a lot of decisions that I think could have benefited a lot of people. So I sometimes walked on the other side of the road. Give you another example. Got two friends of mine down in Arkansas who were driving down towards Little Rock, and they spotted a man on the side of the road, and they stopped to check on him, see if he was okay. And he had a flat tire, and for whatever reason, his jack was not working. One of the kids immediately, and I say kids, they're my age now, one of the young men at the time recognized the person immediately. And the other person didn't, and kind of said, what are you gawking at? And it was actually, it was an actor. His name's Ashton Kutcher. He's known for different movies and television shows and philanthropy. He had broken down on the side of the road, headed south towards Little Rock. And two young men stopped, helped him, and got his car put back together. And, they thanked him, or he thanked them, and offered some sort of, reimbursement or some sort of payment or benefit. They said, no, it's not necessary. I mean, just stopping to help. It literally could have been anybody. But it had the appearance of need. And for every person that we pass thinking that, they probably don't need help. AAA's on the way. They don't need. What's $5 going to do to them? They're not really hungry. They're just, they just want it for drugs. They just want it for alcohol. Ashton Kutcher put out a tweet. Maybe, I don't know. I'm horrible with social media. It literally could have been anything. Tweet, a Facebook thing. I don't know. I'm very, very terrible with that stuff. But he put something out there thanking the two young men. And what was very encouraging to me, of course, as soon as I saw their names, I knew. But what was very encouraging to other individuals was when he mentioned the school that they were from, which was Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas. Two young Christian men had stopped, because they knew the difference. They knew the difference that there is no difference. When you see need, when you assess need, it's our job. There was no assessment here. And I think that's another reason why we don't know the nationality, race, or social position of the man that was robbed. There was no assessment here on the behalf of the Samaritan. There clearly was on the priests and Levites' part. So I understand why some commentaries might say that this was a Samaritan on the side of the road. But there was clearly an assessment on their part. They recognized need and they chose not to help for whatever reason. There was no assessment on the Samaritan's part. There was no, wonder if he's dangerous, he looks really hurt, maybe he deserved it. It was not uncommon at this time for people to pose as people in danger, and then you yourself would be robbed as a result of helping them. That spiel has been around for clearly thousands of years. There's no hesitation. We don't read of any hesitation here. And even though this, again, may not be a true story because it's based off of a parable, or it is a parable rather, there's a reason why Christ mentions that it's an immediate effect. He saw him, took pity on him. There's no sense of judgment, no fear. And then verse 34, he went to him. Seamless transition. Why is this difficult, do you think? Why do you think it's difficult for us to do these things? The parable of the Good Samaritan has always been one of my long favorites because it's one that I can read again and again and again, and I find myself shaking my head at myself because I feel like I still hadn't quite got it down yet, as many times as I've read it. You know, what makes it difficult for us to help others when we see help or when we see that need is there? What gets in the way? I think it's different for everybody. And I think that's also a sub point that can be taken away from this. Although the Levite and the priest had a lot in common, we're not sure if their justifications for passing on the other side of the road were the same or not. If we want a reason to pass on the other side of the road, we're always going to find one. We're commanded to take the extra mile. We're commanded to help, to repair, to provide rest if we can, and to do so without yield. There was no knowing what type of cost that man the Samaritan would come back to from the innkeeper. Whatever it is, I'll reimburse you. Multiple lessons to take away from this, not only just in how we engage with everyone else, but also how we engage with our faith. If you find yourself more oftentimes than not being the individual that passes on the side of the road, which again, I'm guilty of that as well. I think it takes, again, that compassionate understanding, that contextual position. What the Samaritan chose to have for the man on the side of the road and what Christ decided to have for the expert. Can you imagine with what ease it would have been for Christ to just completely decimate and embarrass this expert? Taking minimal effort at all, but to show restraint, and dare I say even respect, allowed him to answer with a context that he knew he would reference the law. It was the old law was the only reference the lawyer had. He was an expert. In our confrontations, our adversarial exchanges with others, do we offer that same perspective, that same compassionate yield? If that's the struggle of yours, I think the individuals here in this congregation would be more than happy to offer prayers, comfort, support, whatever's needed. I think it's been said many times since I've been here since July, this is a giving and very gracious and caring congregation. So anytime there's struggles among us, I think we need not worry about those being adequately addressed. So if you have one of those concerns tonight, please step forward as we stand and sing.
Shall I crucify my Savior when for me he bore